which methods do you want to apply, what do you want to compare. But then you have already seen.
Yes.
Let's do that.
Yeah, but then you don't know what the methods do, so what shall I
Work backwards.
do?
No, I'm being serious. I'm actually being serious.
Okay, so then we will get time.
Yeah, but then we would have ended on the first day. I just gave you a list of.
I guess
So you give me a comment. Do I guess correctly that some people are feeling lost in the formulae, or?
Well, I got the first yesterday and Monday was okay. Today I'm slightly lost, but I want to see some implementation of it.
Yes, I mean, so if you're not really, so what do you say in English, not really familiar or at home with the mathematics, then it is quite easy to feel lost. And I'm always trying to explain the intuition what the method does, and of course there's a mathematical model attached to it. How particular you do it is also quite important for that it works. But in the end, I mean, the lectures 6 to 8 have just been methods, some methods which could be great ideas or not. There's no way to know for your specific data set, but I'm just telling you about 3 classes of methods and also caveats for those methods which are not necessarily, but of course they have to do with the mathematics. So if you know in the kernel methods you have, so if you have a support vector machine, you need to tune the C and the sigma. If I just tell you use a support vector machine, and then it will not work. But why will it not work? The most frequent mistake people make in practice with support vector machines is they don't tune the parameters and they don't normalize the data before they apply it, and then of course it's no wonder it doesn't work if you don't do the tuning. But how do you do the tuning? That I have explained yesterday. If I say okay, tune it, then you wouldn't know what to do. So it's a little bit interrelated. And I have actually thought about having the summary on the first day, but that would be a little bit.
Oh, not that backwards.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe nobody will show up on the second day. Anyway, neural networks. So, before I explain how neural networks work with a bit of math, what are neural networks good for? Or what do they do? So as I have said, supervised learning mostly, that's what they are used mostly in current applications. And there's particular applications which are traditionally known to be good for neural networks, and where I think it is more or less beyond doubt that neural networks are a great idea to apply. One is audio, so speech, audio, images and videos. So probably all of you have seen the experiments on MNIST or CFAR or these image classification applications, of which there are many videos on the web as well. Handwriting being quite close to the image application. Text, so text recognition, text classification, document mining, anything that has to do with text type sequences seems to be a good application scenario. And also, so learning policy, reinforcement learning. So especially you might have heard recently about the spectacular the Go match between the neural network and one of the world champions. But neither of these applications is particularly new. So since the 80s actually these have been known, so neural networks have been playing backgammon in the 90s. They have been used to classify images already a while ago. But the spectacular successes in the last decade, they are, well, if you ask the experts, I'm not a neural network expert, they are due not to new technical ideas, though of course there's a number of ideas that have been added over the time. time, the main ideas have also been there since the 80s or the 90s, such as convolution, backdrop, pooling ensembles. What has happened recently is the massive parallelization and massive computational power that has been combined with the concept and so-called deep, which means more complex architectures of neural networks than you could actually compute in the 90s. I mean, the advent of graphics cards, which are nowadays mainly bought to play computer games, but they have architectural properties which make them quite nice pieces of hardware to run massively parallelized computations on. If you use not deep neural networks but small neural networks, the simple neural networks actually also perform reasonably well, usually on classification tasks and regression tasks. Though, what I'm not aware of would be a larger empirical study or a corpus of results tells you that neural networks are generally a good idea in regression type tasks, and whether if you go from the from a simple multi-layer perceptron to deep architectures, whether that really is of benefit outside the application areas that I have listed at the beginning. So just to repeat this again: image, video, text, audio, and policy learning, which is somewhat surprising because you would at least expect that people have tried, but this is possibly not an issue specifically with the deep learning community, but there seems to be a general lack in comparison type studies when it comes to machine learning applications. Anyway, so in the bottom I have given one literature reference which gives a nice historical overview by Schmidhuber, which also explains a little bit more the historical development, so when which idea has entered the neural network canon and when which competitions were won or how neural networks performed over the time. So the current deep learning phase, I think, is lasting since 2000, 2005, 2006, when these deep architectures have started beating other algorithms to the ground in these traditional applications, particularly on the image classification, pattern recognition side. General questions. I'm putting this slide at the very beginning before actually explaining what a neural network is. Questions so far? Okay, so now what is a neural network? So I'm going to explain the so-called feed-forward networks. There's always variants on the theme, as there is with any of the method classes I have been outlining, but in the simplest incarnation of the feed-forward network. So it is actually just a complex nested prediction function. So it has some inputs, and it has some outputs, and as any such prediction function, it is optimized and fitted to the data in certain ways. So nested means you consecutively apply multivariate linear functions and univariate linear functions, so-called activations, repeatedly. So first a multivariate linear function, and then you have some results, and you apply the nonlinear transition function, and again you take the results and you apply the linear function, then you take the result, then you apply the univariate nonlinear function, and so on and so on. And each time you do this, it's a so-called layer of the neural network. So it's meant, as is usually depicted, as a network graph, so how the results of the last iteration of applying the functions feed in the new iteration of applying the functions is depicted in the so-called network graph that you quite often see when neural networks are talked about. What this is supposed to model is actually, in a very stylized way how neurons work in biology, where you also have neurons, cells in your body transmitting electrical information, connecting to each other, and only if a number of them fire, then there would be an impulse transmitted. Hence you have this activation function which models having enough impulse, having enough electrical activation incoming, so the neuron is going to be activated and further transmitting electrical activation to the next layer. So the type of graph we would see is we have your inputs X, I put them at the bottom, people often put them at the top, but I guess we can do it either way. So in the first phase, the inputs are substituted in linear functions, then in the nonlinear functions, and then again and again. So once here in the first red layer, and you do it again and maybe once more, and then you have the output layer, which is your set of final results. So that's the type of function which is nested and highly nonlinear, which is or which models a neural network. So in practice, this is just computed inside the computer. Deep learning, what does that mean? It just means there's more than one hidden layer, usually between 3 and 10. But of course, you can go crazy and 100 if you wish. I mean, if you have enough graphic cards, why not?
What do you mean by multivariate? More than different factors?
Yes. I mean, multivariate just means your linear function takes many of the outputs from the previous layers, alpha 1 times output 1 plus alpha 2 times output 1. And so univariate would be just, it multiplies a constant to one output. Okay, so mathematically, since you're already asking, so what is happening? What is happening here? So let's write YIL for the output of the ith node in the L layer. So in the slides, my convention will be that the big L plus first layer, that will be the output layer, and the 0th layer will be the input layer. So depending on which book you read, you find a different convention. Whether the input layer is counted already as the first layer or not. So of course, this also may vary in terms of implementation, which package you use. If you say you have 3 layers, you might just have 1 intermediate layer, or you might have 3 intermediate layers, and in total 5 layers if you count the input or output layer or not. So in each layer, in each step, so we have you first apply a linear function. So the connection weights are what I call the alpha, just briefly in the answer, but so usually called weights, by which the inputs from the previous layer are weighted. So this is the output of the Lth layer, and it depends on the outputs of the L minus 1, the previous layer. So it depends in particular only on the previous layer in this feed-forward network architecture by a linear function plus some kind, plus an intercept, we would call in regression. In neural networks, it's called the activation bias due to the analogy with the real-life neural networks. And then you have this linear function, and you're applying some activation function. And then you repeat, right? So the L, you get the first output layer from the inputs, right? So yi0, that's the first output that you repeat, and rinse and repeat. And what I'm also going to use here is partially matrix and vector notation. So instead of a sum, I'm just going to write a matrix product. So, and the activation function will be applied component-wise, since to some formulae have less indices about which you will have to worry.
How do you know which weights to assign?
That's the second question.
Yeah.
Now I'm only explaining the shape of the function.
Okay.
In the next step, I'm going to explain how to find the parameters in your function, but just to point out, following a question, what are the parameters? So the y's are determined from the inputs, given the parameters which are the w's, the b's, and the shape of the sigmas. So some of these are going to be hyperparameters, parameters, some of these are going to be determined depending on the data, and the B's and the W's are going to be determined in the data. The rest is going to be hyperparameters that you can fix or choose or tune over. So activation functions are usually the same per layer, and also usually the same for each color of layer here. So the same for each hidden layer, but in the output layer you might have a different activation function. So in each hidden layer, you usually have one of these functions below here. So the most frequently used and the most empirically successful are the sigmoid, which directly gives you a link to logistic regression here. So in the logistic regression, you also have a link, which is called a link function there, and then you will have the activation function, but in both cases, it is the same mathematical function, the sigmoid or the logistic. Then more recently, people have been using the rectified linear activation function, or ReLU, sometimes called. So if you depict these two functions in a 2D coordinate system, as I probably should have done on the slide, the sigmoid will look like this. It will go from 0 to 1 smoothly, versus the rectified linear will just follow this sigmoid. The ReLU only activates if you have a positive signal, right? So the sigmoid activates a little bit if you have a negative signal, but as the signal becomes positive, it activates more, but there's a maximum to the activation of it, whereas the ReLU looks like this. So it does not activate at all for a negative signal, and it is unbounded for positive signals.
Sorry, why do you need the activation functions?
It's because without it doesn't work.
No, but what's the
answer? So
what's the? Is it to
there's
introduce
tools,
nonlinearities,
there's
for example?
mathematical and the biological idea behind it. So in biological neural network, you need enough incoming signals to activate the following neuron. So for example, if there were, so in a very stylized scenario, you could imagine in the end you have a neuron for one class and a neuron for another class. Now you have incoming some features, right? And if you have this feature, then it is more likely to appear in one class. So these features are going to activate the banana class neuron, and the other features are going to activate the lemon class neuron. But only if you have things coming together, like it's yellow and it is round and it smells like a lemon, then you would activate the lemon neuron. But if you have only a few things coming together, you would not activate that neuron. And this thresholding behavior, right? So you only want to decide for a lemon if you have enough incoming signal. This thresholding is done by the activation function. So the ReLU, for example, makes the neuron fire only if the sum of the incoming activation is positive.
Okay.
Mathematically spoken, you can think about logistic regression. So if you have one layer only, then in two classes, what you actually get is logistic regression. Right? So you can also think about this in terms of probabilities and odds. So you're trying to model the odds of, well, if you nest it, of course you're modeling the odds of some intermediate feature that is hidden, some hidden feature. You're trying to model if you have only one layer, right, then you have logistic regression, and you're trying to model the odds of the class of the classes as a linear function in the features. You nest it, you're trying to model the odds of each intermediate layer in terms of the hidden features.
But you said that the activation function will be the same across the layer, right?
Yeah.
So how do you know how do the triggers differ, like you said, you know, depending
Well,
on
you
the
have to
signal?
fit your model somehow, which I haven't explained yet. But assuming the model is fitting properly, and the fitting is intriguingly similar to logistic regression. So logistic regression, you can fit by maximizing the likelihood, so by gradient descent or expectation maximization on a certain loss.
I think maybe the weights are the ones that differentiate the different activation functions, right? So
No.
if
The
the
weight
shape
not
is the
part of
same-
activation function.
If the shape is the same across all the activation functions,
Yes.
how?
So it's different features.
Mhm.
So the weights will differentiate. So maybe one neuron may construct a complicated feature for the yellowness. The other one might construct a complicated feature for shape or whatever. And actually, if you take apart the image processing networks, you actually see these things have the same shape and contour are modeled in the intermediate layers. But it will be, of course, different shapes, different contours, different features. So each neuron in the middle, one can imagine, stands for a different feature of the data. And whether it activates or not will depend on whether the feature is there in the data set you see, or also in the data point you see.
So if you had very simplistic data, you wouldn't need as many layers.
You would expect, yes.
For more complex, the data you start off with, the more layers you're likely to need to come up with a definitive.
Yeah, I mean that seems plausible. Though one can also say maybe there is like 4 layers are enough for everything.
But
That would
you
also
don't have
be-
the same risk of overfitting.
You do have a risk of overfitting. I mean, you have an obvious risk of overfitting here. So see how many parameters you have.
If you-
You have 3 layers and 100 neurons in each layer, and then there is from each neuron going to each other neuron. There is so there is 100 times 100 weights because it goes from each one to each other neuron. Like you already have 10,000 weights, then okay, you have much less of these activation bias. Right? There's only 300 of them. So we have 20,300 parameters if you do not count possible parameters that you could have in the input or output layer. So you are quite at risk of overfitting here. And without further modification, neural networks will overfit heavily. How to get around that is also one thing that has only been slowly solved over the decades. So, but it's clear why this seems a candidate for overfitting.
And apart from the techniques you will explain later, is there any simple rule of thumb we can use to make sure the size we choose to start with, or at least the boundaries of the size we
Oh,
want to research,
I have a slide with the table of.
so we avoid overfitting? That's what I mean. A little bit of a rule of thumb, so
Well,
we
you
don't.
can check whether it overfits with the validation I have shown yesterday and Thursday.
But I mean up front, so you can already choose a neural net which you know is not big, that big is going to overfit,
Yeah, there's regularization techniques which prevent overfitting in the first place.
even if you choose a huge neural net compared to your data features.
It's in theory. So of course, we have seen yesterday in the ensemble methods lecture, if you have a method that is likely to overfit, bagging it is a good idea. So bagged neural networks are one way to get rid of the overfitting.
But doesn't the activation function
Yes.
sort of compensate for that? Because if it doesn't activate, then it's not contributing to the solution.
But there's a lot of neurons, so some will activate and some won't. So you would hope it compensates, but empirically it actually doesn't. There's just too many neurons. They just, randomly activate or not, more or less, if you have enough data.
So what's the benefit of the activation function?
Well, the activation function is needed to make it work at all. If you wouldn't have the activation function, this would be nested chaos. Dampening is one reason.
But the normal functions we've been talking about before don't have this factor where it kicks in at a certain point.
Well, the activation functions, they dampen negative outputs, right? So they dampen
So smooth on.
chaos on the
So,
things out.
but we haven't come across this in previous methods.
Across.
This dampening concept.
It's not really a concept, it's an intuition. So one doesn't really know why neural networks work well. If asked in that generality.
Okay.
So logistic regression is a special case, and there are certain ideas which justify logistic regression.
I guess there could be some.
Hidden variable models are a special case, and there's reasons that justify the use of hidden feature models.
I guess there could be scenarios where you want an activation function to be bound between 1 and -1, right? It's like R10, I guess. Because, say for example,
Yeah, hackable it counts.
yeah, because say for example you want to generate a signal where I would say like 1 meant always a stop.
Yeah, so people have used that in the past, but it's dying out for reasons I'm not really sure about. So I'm not sure whether it's because it's not good or just because people are not using it. People today use ReLU because it's easy, partly because it's easy to just set everything negative to 0 if you have a massive parallelized computation environment.
In that situation, when you just like run it twice, one for the buy, one for the sell option,
Yeah,
and see which one you get.
yeah,
Like,
but
higher result.
you could have 1, 0, -1. So 0 don't do anything.
Then you get
1,
a bunch
But
of
the
those ones out.
the output layer classification, you usually put the softmax, so you get probabilities for each class.
Oh, okay.
So you get a probability for yes or no. So actually neural networks implicitly give you a prediction that is probabilistic, just as logistic regression gives you probabilities, or if you have multinomial logistic regression, it gives you probabilities for each class. Questions about the shape? Yes?
So deep learning, you're saying has like 3 to 10 layers,
Or 100?
or 100.
Or
And
one.
how does that compare to like the brain?
Oh,
How many layers in the brain is that known, or is
I
it?
don't know.
It's a lot of neurons, but
It's not really layers, right?
yeah.
If
So-
you look at the visual cortex, there's regions, but the neurons connect in some structured way, which are not entirely understood.
So you can
But
have
there's
input
a lot
neurons
more,
which
a
are
lot more neurons in the brain.
yeah, but you can have input ones which are output ones in other kind of regimes.
They're not really inputs and outputs at the brain.
Depends on the IQ.
Well, yeah, it depends on the IQ. So sometimes you don't have input. Yes. So there's this principle, so you first apply a linear function, then per neuron a activation function, then you combine all outputs in a linear way, then again you apply the activation function, and that's it.
But this is only multivariate, right? In the previous slide, you also mentioned univariate.
The activation function is univariate because you're applying, so this is a scalar for each neuron, the result of this linear function here, so the input to the linear function is many variables. Then you get out a number. To that number, the activation function is applied by reading for the x value and the y value in this diagram.
And then the sigma doesn't depend on x1 to x.
It does, implicitly. So the YIL depends on the YIL minus 1. The YIL minus 1 depends on the YIL minus 2, and so on. And YI0 is by convention the input layer on which everything depends. So it is a function that takes the input layer and gives the output layer. The whole thing is one function, one horribly complicated nested function. Okay? Is that
what does the softmax function look like?
Compared to this.
Oh, it's a multivariate function.
Okay.
But it's a weighted average. It's a weighted average with the exponential. So if you would put here scaling factor in, put the scaling factor in, and you let the scaling factor go to infinity, it's going to be the maximum. But it's not infinity, so it is a soft maximum. Okay. So it is almost the maximum, but the biggest value will have the biggest weight. Okay, so now we have learned how the function looks like, but now we are going to have to determine all the bias and weight terms. So at each layer, actually, we have a number of weights, which is the number of neurons in the layer L minus 1 times the number of neurons in the layer L, and we have bias terms, which is the number of neurons which we need to fit. So luckily, we do not have parameters in the activation function, but we have a choice of activation function. But let's just assume we have already chosen one activation function, such as the ReLU. So the W's for each layer are a matrix, so parameterized by two indices, but actually there is for each layer a W. So this is what mathematicians might call a tensor if there is the same number of neurons in each layer. So sometimes you hear neural network or deep learning people mention how we're doing tensor learning or something.
TensorFlow.
Yeah, I mean TensorFlow is one package that it's exactly how the word tensor comes in. Though it is not necessarily what all communities would understand as the word tensor. Though tensor, of course, is simply just a generalization of, so in the index notation way, it's a generalization of a matrix where you can have multiple indices. So an array of dimension 3 or larger, and you can there's multiplication rules for tensors like for matrices. You can put your indices here and there, and if you will ask a physicist, then he will think of tensors as multi-dimensional linear maps, and there's the same type of duality between tensors and linear maps as between matrices and linear maps, just in a multivariate way. And these, you have a vector pair layer, and you have multiple layers, so if there is the same number of neurons per layer, it's going to be a matrix. The stylized approach, how you fit it, so you start with some output loss, and you fit the values by minimizing this output loss using gradient descent. And so it's a complicated function. The parameters of the functions are the W's and B's. So you can find the minimum of your loss in those parameters given the data that you substitute. Right? So what you do is gradient descent. In the case of neural networks, there is specific simplifications you can make. So if you recall, layer L depends on layer L minus y, so it's a highly nested function. So if you do gradient descent, you will need to compute the gradient, and by the chain rule, you will get a horrible expansion, because each time, if you just do it the naive way, you get, so you have 100, maybe if you have 100 neurons, you have 100 inputs, and each time the number of terms you get multiplies by 100 per layer. So this might not be a good idea, it seems, but actually, if you compute the derivatives, so everything is to be interpreted with the right multiplication, so the right summation over indices. This is not necessarily always matrix multiplication, but it can also be a summation over indices, over some indices of the tensor, and or tensor multiplication, but modulo that issue, right? generally that issue, the gradients have this form if written down in a somewhat simplified way. So these are matrix differentials, but if you just put an index here, you will have the same index on the right, and some of these might be 0, or some of these might not be 0. All I'm trying to show is the specific form of the gradient. So with the gradient descent, right, with the gradient descent, you need to make a derivative of this composite function. You take a derivative of the composite function, which is the first thing that comes in after taking the derivative of this loss. So with the derivatives, you arrive at terms that only have derivatives of the last layer. Right? So the derivative of the nth layer's output with respect to anything will be a linear function in the derivative of the last layer's output with respect to the same thing. So you only have dependencies on the last layer, right? You have only dependencies in the last layer, and if you take a derivative with the same layer, you get also linear functions in these z's, so in this derivative of the activation function applied to the input. So if you compute the derivatives of the activation function stored at the layer L, then you get an easy way to compute the whole derivative, because the same terms up to linear transformation will just appear multiple times. So you can come up with very efficient ways of evaluating this derivative just by the fact that a number of terms appear a large number of times, and there is a dependence that only goes from the top layer to the bottom. So you have a dependence in one way, meaning you can evaluate the gradient passing from the bottom to the top, which is the direction opposite to how you would evaluate the neural network function itself. Hence, this strategy, or well, a family of strategies which computes, evaluates the gradient in a nesting direction that is opposite to evaluating the function itself, is called backpropagation. And it is more efficient to store, partially store, results of your computation, including linear evaluations of your various derivatives, than just to naively evaluate the gradient. Again, if you naively evaluate the gradient, you get to multiply the number of terms by the number of neurons every time. But in this case, the number of evaluations here stays bounded by the number of neurons and connections in each pair of layers that you go back through. But still, it's a large number of linear operations that you have to carry out to compute the gradient. The bottleneck here is matrix multiplication. It's multiplication of, well, arrays in essence, so multiplication of tensors, but per layer is a matrix. It's doing matrix multiplication over and over, which takes up the computational time, but you also see how you would expect this to be parallelizable, say, over neurons. Questions? So now that if you have computed your gradient, in an efficient way, which I have not exactly written up as an algorithm, but working from this special structure of the nesting, you can, I guess, work out your own backpropagation rule for evaluating the gradient. Once you have the gradient, you make an update to the parameters W and V, and you can make this update layer by layer. And you see in this update, you take the derivative of the loss function with respect to your with respect to the parameters as as you usually do in gradient update. And the trick is here, of course, that you have to split it in the derivative of the output with respect to the parameters and the derivative of the cross function with respect to the output. So this is the easy part. This is the difficult to evaluate part for which you use backpropagation. And then you have here the gamma. So you see one more hyperparameter coming in there. The step size for the gradient update, or maybe you could do a more smarter way of gradient update, which we will discuss in a minute. But there's at least one parameter coming in here. You do not count the way in which the gradient descent is done.
Where is here then the original data? Because I didn't see a lot of.
The original data is in the loss. So the loss quantifies the gradient. So you have your original data x, the features, and the y, the labels. The loss is perhaps the squared loss. So you take the derivative of the loss on the data you have observed.
So you also need to function still. With F. Because that was not present.
Yeah, the f is the horrible thing. The f is yl plus 1 with its implicit dependence on the y0, which is the x. So here we use that y0 is the x's, yl plus 1 is the y's.
Okay, but what is F?
But the f is the nested function. So I just substituted everything.
But we don't know what it is. It's just like it's hidden function.
Now the f is this here. So f is defined in this way. So this is a recursive rule that gives you the y's being yl, the last layer, in terms of the x's, which is y0. The f is the nested thing given in this way.
So F is YL plus 1.
No. Yes. F is yl plus 1 in terms of y0. Yes. But it's not yl plus 1, which is the output, but it's yl plus 1 seen as a function of y0.
Can we use the Go competition as an example to fit this? So, no, what I'm asking is, can you use that as an example to work through the process step? So every time you
because for policy, the type of neural network is more complicated. So it's not just a supervised learning problem, it's a reinforcement learning problem. But we could use the image classification example.
Okay.
So in the image classification example, the outputs say you have images of cats, dogs, and bananas. Then you have three classes. The class can be cat, dog, or banana, and the output will be probabilities for each class. As inputs, you have the different pixels of pictures of cats, dogs, and bananas. So maybe it's a 16 times 16 pixel picture of cats, dogs, and bananas. So you have 256 values of gray if it's a grayscale image. If it's color image, you might have 256 times 4. That's the input. Does that make it clear?
Okay. I'm thinking about the learning process, for example, because it calibrates itself every time you learn something new.
So in the learning process, you do the gradient update. So f is a function. F is a function of the features. So what you're going to do, you are going to come up with a loss function that tells you how well an f of this form is going to fit your data.
Yes.
So the loss are f of x, y. So let's say this is one data point, but for multiple data points we can just sum over the loss. Right, so this is so f is a function which has all these parameters there. So let's make the parameters w and b explicit. So the loss is actually a function. This is a function in the data and the parameters. So the data are fixed, training data, these are optimized. So fixing the training data, you can find W and B by optimizing the loss.
So, for example, let's say that you have a data about clouds, and you want to find out if you can predict if it's going to rain. Yeah. So, if I understand correctly, my last function would be the probability of the rain. Defined mathematically. Because this is my output. Probability.
So shall we go back to the image example which we have just discussed? Bananas and dogs and
yeah, we can go to the image example, although this is
So the loss function is the
It's whether it's
error
rained
you
or
made.
not.
It's like an error.
It's an
It's the
error.
error.
That's the error.
yes,
So
that's
you
the
want
error.
to reduce that, don't you?
Yes.
So what you can do is it's going to readjust your weight, etc. until that.
Yes.
Yeah.
On the training system.
to minimize
So
your
you-
chances
For
of getting it wrong.
example,
yeah, exactly.
and for example, it could
Correct.
be the loss.
Yeah, that's why it's here.
So the loss will be negative P and L.
Well, it depends on your goal.
I
So
guess
if you
in
want to
this
predict
training example would be whether it goes up and down, and the probability of going up and down.
Yeah, but I don't know if it was like, if it was accurate, if I use those decisions to make a trading decision.
But that's the key thing. So what are you trying to compare against? Are you trying to compare against a potential P&L, or you compare against price movements? So if you want to forecast prices, then if it forecasts,
I see, yeah,
then
fine.
that's fine.
Yeah, it depends on application, yeah. I'm just using an example where you're using it to make trading decisions. So you can assess whether those decisions are right.
So does it work like this?
P&L, right?
First,
By what?
By your P&L as one parameter. So then, in this case, you want to minimize the loss function, which will be minimize the loss of
Yeah.
So it's just like least squares regression. So in least squares regression you have your alphas and your betas, right? You minimize the residual sum of squares given the data in the alphas and betas. So you get the alphas and betas and minimize your residual sum of squares for regression. Everyone happy with that? Now here instead of alphas and betas you have W's and B's. You minimize, say, your residual sum of squares, it would be one loss, so R would be the residual sum of squares. You minimize that given W and B. Given the data in W and B. So you find your W and B for your network as the W and B minimizing a certain loss, such as the residual sum of squares in regression. It's the same thing as in linear regression, but you know just many more parameters. But you have an efficient way of optimizing.
and in doing this, are you then feeding the data points in one by one? Or is this minimization done of all data points in one go?
You can do both, but in practice what you do is here, say in this line, so usually do it in batches and equals. So you run the training set through multiple times, so you can do it twice, thrice, and in batches. So this loss function is actually a loss function for a batch of data. Say you see 100 new images, then you do a gradient update on your network with this 100 new images. Then you take the next 100, you run the gradient update with that, then you get new 100 images, you run it with that, and maybe you're reusing the same batch multiple times, say multiple epochs. There's batches and epochs in the update, but in principle, so in the stylized case, it could just feed it once to all the data, like in linear regression, though in practice that's not going to be a good idea.
But it's not sequential in that way. That
It is.
Yeah, okay.
It is. It is. You can do online learning easily with it.
But this optimization can also be done on say 5 points.
Yes.
In the same way.
So there you see it. You have more hyperparameters appearing there, right? So how large are your batches, and how often do you use them to train the network? How many epochs do you run? So the batch size and the epoch number are now hyperparameters that you can set or tune, apart from the type of the update and the step size, which we already have noted.
So the training is to recognize pictures of cats.
For example.
Give it 1,000 pictures of cats, and you can then give it another picture, and it will give you a degree of confidence that that is or isn't a cat.
Or a dog.
Or a dog,
Yes.
or a cat, or a dog, or a tank, or whatever the pictures
So,
are.
so usually the classes will be predefined.
So that's degree of confidence in recognizing something.
Yes.
That's not the same concept as playing a game.
No, no.
As-
So for the policy networks, you need to adapt this context and this method to reinforcement learning. Right? So you will have outputs, but you cannot check them. You cannot check whether you have made the right decision before you have won the game. So you actually have to iterate internally over playing multiple games. So of course you can do this in the computer, because you need to get the reinforcement signal that you win the game or not.
So you have to play to the end of the game for it to have learned whether that was a good move or not.
Yeah, exactly. So for that you need additional ideas. So the optimization is actually done in similar ways, but you need to so you need to track back to the decisions you have made, whether they actually have led to a favorable outcome or not, to quantify the goodness of the decision inside the network that you have made at that point.
So in this respect, if you want to win a game of Go, then you really have to fit in all these matches that have been won. Or is this work like that?
Well, no, not necessarily. You just have so one central part of it. You have to have the network play many matches, and one thing that people have done is playing matches against itself. So this always will have an opponent of comparative strength.
And okay, so with your pictures example, let's say.
That's not reinforcement learning.
No,
So we were
but coming
talking
back.
about simple supervised learning today.
Yeah,
because that's
exactly.
already.
No, coming back to the basics.
Yes.
So let's say once the algorithm is working, then let's say the output of feeding in the picture would be the probability of this picture being a lemon, yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So you will have in the output layer neurons for each class, and that will give you the probability with which the network believes it is a picture of a certain type.
Yeah.
of a certain class.
Okay.
Sorry, just
Yes.
one more question. If you could explain propagation in simple terms, say like one line, what would be your...
Efficient evaluation of a nested gradient.
But where does the back propagation, like the effect that what you were saying, that, you just need to know kind of the end and so the boundaries kind of thing to calculate.
So propagation, so we evaluate the network by forward propagation, because this layer you compute from this layer you compute from the one with the house number one over.
Yeah.
So it's forward propagation for evaluating the network.
Yeah.
Now the dependence in the gradients is just the other way around. Because if you take the derivative, then of course since layer L depends only on layers below,
Assuming you calculated.
by the chain rule, derivatives only from layers below will appear as summons. The efficient way of evaluation in this case, if you look at the expressions, is actually propagating the derivative or the error back. So the sequence of computation computation is just reversed by the dependency or the derivative.
I'm just trying to understand why it's sufficient, right? Why, you know,
If you imagine like the Fibonacci sequence, so 1 + 1 is 2, 2 + 1 is 3, 3 + 2 is 5, etc.
yeah,
Then to calculate Fibonacci of like 1,000,000 would take you a long time.
yeah, so you do
But
it
if you
recurrently.
Yeah, but if you can store all of the results, then you can basically just kind
Go
of
back
record
one layer.
each one and just be like, right, what's Fibonacci 100? Well, I calculated 99 and I've got it, so I can pick it up. So it's far more efficient to do that than it is to kind of just blindly go in and try and calculate it.
So that's like a memory.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a memory issue in this sense. It's an efficiency issue. So you store stuff, and the sequence, the stored stuff is used as just reverse from how you would originally evaluate your network. Just typically in this example, that's a nice example.
Yeah, okay.
Questions? Yeah, okay. So of course, gradient descent you have to initialize somehow. Everyone familiar with gradient descent? No? Yes. So gradient descent is about minimizing or maximizing a function, and what you do essentially if some function that might be terribly nonlinear, you start somewhere, then you draw tangent to the function, you go in that direction, and then continue until you reach the smallest value. And if all things go well, you reach the minimum. And of course, how far you go in the direction of the gradient being the direction of steepest descent. Well, you have to figure out, but that's the direction. That's the principle behind it. But you can only do this if the function is explicit. If it is complicated and terribly long, like this one, so you cannot analytically compute the minimum of this one. Right, and you need to start somewhere as well, which if the function is horrible and non-explicit, it's not entirely clear where you start. Now, there is not the best way to start, but there's a lot of bad ways to start the gradient descent. So if you start with, so initialize your weight with 0, then the gradient will vanish evidently because the W is in all the products. Now if you initialize W very large, right, then for the sigmoid it will be very small. So okay, it could be good for the restricted linear ones, but it's still bad. So good W will be close to 0, but not exactly 0. Things people have tried, or so Su-Yan Lee-Kun being one of the gurus in neural networks has suggested to take just uniform between the square root of the number of layers, and that has so the idea behind that is just to have a vector which is approximately of unit length. You think, or matrix norm, which you think about. So for each row, or you can just take the standard normal, which if you sample from it will never be exactly 0, but close to 0. Then recently also some advanced strategies have been proposed along the lines of unsupervised pre-training. So the idea there is to run any of the following unsupervised neural networks on the features only, so leaving the labels away, and then keeping the weights that those networks have learned as initialization weights. And people have found that sometimes this can improve, so unsupervised pre-training might improve the performance of your deep neural network. So some deep neural networks which I'm going to explain, which are unsupervised, usually Boltzmann neural networks in the all-to-one order. And then continue with the weights the unsupervised method has found in the supervised way. Okay. Then, one issue we have already seen, overfitting is an issue with neural networks if you just use the naive backpropagation idea, because there's a lot of parameters, sure, and so if you keep on doing your gradient descent, you will just completely overfit. So solutions for overfitting we have seen two. I've mentioned regularization already in yesterday, and also we have seen methods of variance reduction such as bagging. Just a brief list to kind of look at. So the first thing people have come up with was early stopping. So you just stop your gradient descent before you really have reached the minimum. So this implicitly regularizes against finding a minimum which overfits, but it's of course heuristic, so there's no real rule that tells you when to stop. Now, ensemble, of course, boosting bagging, that's usually great, though if you have large neural networks and if you have an ensemble of them, it might be computationally expensive. Then, of course, you can use independent validation, right, for at regular intervals applied now to your model parameters, the model parameters themselves, of your gradient descent. So you discard descent directions or discard a change if it shows to be bad on independent data. Of course, you can do this only if you have large amounts of data, and it's furthermore computationally expensive to do all the loops we have seen in hyperparameter fitting. Explicit regularization. So if you're coming from the numerics angle, we will have probably seen the different types of penalization, regularization, L2, L1, and so on. You can do that. And most recently, dropout that has been proposed only a few years ago. It is in essence boosting, but implicitly through your network structure. So I'm going to briefly explain how that works, because it is nowadays quite standard to do, because it avoids the computational expense of ensembling, of the ensembling solution to the overfitting issue. The
So
idea
are you
is,
saying that if you apply correctly the dropout regularization, you don't even need to bother consider ensembling and bagging? It's an either or?
well, so the authors of the dropout paper argue it is an alternative to bagging, which is less costly. I mean, there's nothing going to stop you from doing dropout and then ensembling, except limited computational resources, perhaps. And of course, you can try to evaluate how good this is, but I do not have any results, or I don't know any literature on whether doing dropout and then ensembling is going to help you, except that I can tell you that it's going to eat up a lot of computational resources, as ensembling usually does in neural networks, if they're large. But if they're small, you could try dropout and ensembling and see whether that's really better. Though it might not be. Anyway, what dropout is, I mean, you do these batch updates to your W and B. So what you do is, independently with constant probability for a layer, you shoot out or you remove connections in your neural network. So you set some of the weights to 0 in each update step. And in each time you update, you do this independently. So what this is not exactly bagging, because it's not done on the level of the features and the data points, but actually it is done within the feed-forward structure of the network. You can quickly derive mathematically how the update would look like. So you just have to carry through a matrix which removes some weights. So again, for the right interpretation of the multiplication here. And empirically, seems to be great, though the momentum or the gradient update needs to be increased if you introduce noise via dropout, and it seems to work well together with the so-called max norm regularization. So you check whether the weights are large, and if they are large, then you set them to be smaller. Not really. Why not? So it's called maximum regularization, but actually what goes in is the Frobenius norm, which is not the max norm. So I'm not entirely sure why it's called the max norm and the Frobenius norm regularization. Anyway, So it may also work well or may not work well with unsupervised training, where the guru suggests that the weights should be then pre-scaled by a factor that comes from the dropout probability. So that's what it does. Questions? And most implementations of neural networks nowadays do have this as a standard parameter.
Are you not just adding more parameters then for tuning?
Oh, sure. I have more parameters for tuning.
But it speeds things
So
up.
what do we have until now? So the number of layers, the number of neurons in each layer, the gradient update, various stuff from the regularization, the batch size, the epo size, and so on. Just summarize these on this slide later on. So we're just adding more hyperparameters as we go along, which is something quite typical with neural networks. So one thing I also should mention, so since we have talked about these favorite applications, so especially images, audio, video, and text applications, where neural networks seem to be quite great. So in those applications, actually some ideas in restricting the structure of the neural networks have helped a lot. So I mentioned the convolutional type of neural networks or layered connections. So what helps there essentially is setting some connections to zero or not having all connections. So what one usually does is for each layer, actually one has spatial directions, two spatial directions. So each layer is arranged in terms of two indices. Right? So for connecting one layer to the next, then you have four indices, namely the x position of your neuron in the first layer, and the y and x and y of the neuron to which it connects in the next layer. So you give the layers a spatial structure, then the tensors or the arrays will have a larger dimension. Important there for this application is sparsity. So not all of the connections are there. Specifically, one idea that is quite crucial especially in the imaging application, that some layers connect only to locations close by on the lower layer. This is combined with copying of weights. So you have copies of layers with the boundary condition that the weights are always the same, and convolutional layers where the function, the linear function, is restricted to be a convolution. So convolution meaning you're summing over indices, and the sum of the indices is always going to be the same, namely the location to which you connect. So this is a discretization, say, of spatial convolution, or if you're from a signal processing background, you will recognize this is a 2D version of a discrete convolution. Why not? I mean, this corresponds to having some weights not there to be zero and some weights to be equal. Then you also have pooling layers where you have small patches from the previous layer that you aggregate, say, by computing the maximum in the aggregated region, which implicitly also relates to some ways that you might recognize from image processing and smoothing. And Jan LeCun has said one of the gurus in neural networks has come up with specific architecture that combines these ideas of the convolutional and sparsity and the pooling in a highly structured network that seems to work pretty well on images. So I'm not sure how much fudging and hand engineering has gone in that, but I mean, of course you can do that. So only the last layer is fully connected. So you have convolution, subsampling, and convolution again, and subsampling with different sizes of your previous layer that you actually pool or aggregate, or different ranges of your sparse connection. Not going into more details on that, and a lot of that does seem heuristical to me. there's always the one paper or the other that suggests a new type of architecture that seems to work well with one particular application. There is favorite network structures that people tend to use in this application. So using these really seems to be really edge.
Sorry, one question. Why do you think that this only works in, or is mainstreaming in images, audio, video, and text recognition, not for
So on one side I have no evidence that this type of connections work elsewhere. On the other hand, if you just look at what would happen in the first layer, so if you have the convolution, this closely relates to Fourier transform, 1D and 2D Fourier transform, which is already known to be a good idea in a signal processing or an image processing context. So if you have pooling, or aggregation, it relates to image smoothing or image processing, contrast enhancement, and so on. So you would also expect this somehow to be a good idea in images, but I wouldn't know why this would be a good idea where you do not have something that has spatial vicinity as a feature of the features. So if the features are themselves located in space, then doing stuff that makes use of a spatial arrangement of the features seems sensible. But if you don't have that, and where do you really have that outside of something that is an image or a video or text, because these are sequences, so where do you really have this? Because isn't spatial vicinity of features a definition of what is an image in the widest sense? Yes?
We should really go for that.
Okay. So then we'll just, so you also will share the slides. These are going to be, there's just a slide on parameter choices, for which there is no real reason to choose the parameters in these ways, except that people have previously observed them to work well. You can have hundreds of neurons or thousands of neurons, 3 to 10 layers in deep learning, but then people have also used like 100s of layers and have seen things work well. With dropout, one might need to change the number of units. An application function, we do now deep learning. Some people are using max out learning rates or in the order of magnitude of 1. The momentums are in the order